back to the Middle East. One of the more memorable exchanges I recall from early in the Iraq War was between you and Charlie Gibson. And it was shortly after the American soldiers had been kidnapped and couple killed, videotape from Iraq TV, the American networks were running of these POWs. And there was a big uproar in the US over this. And Charlie was relatively apoplectic that people were showing footage of these POWs and dead Americans. And you were in Kuwait and you said, hang on, time out, Charlie.
Actually, I was in Iraq at the time.
Okay, all right. Yeah. I thought you were on the south side of the border.
There was actually a big difference in those days.
Yes, no, I understand. But my point is that you said, time out, Charlie. Last night I had a piece on that showed Iraqi POWs, that showed dead Iraqis.
No,
What's the all right, correct me.
Not Iraqi POWs. In point of fact, I mean, the Geneva Convention prohibits putting POWs on display. And we never showed pictures of POWs. But we did show pictures of dead Iraqis. And my argument with Charlie, and I'm actually sorry because Charlie's one of the good guys. Charlie is one of the, I mean, a really superb journalist, but we disagreed on this point. My sense was then, and is far more today than it even was back then, that most Americans do not understand the full consequences of war. What I mean by that is, yeah, sure, in principle, we understand people get killed, people get injured. We send people off to war with the marching bands. When they come back and they're suffering from post-traumatic stress, when they come back with missing limbs, when they come back in flag-draped coffins, we don't pay quite as much attention anymore. And particularly these days, where there is no draft, where in fact even the professional army, which represents the families of less than 1% of all Americans, where there is no tax that has financed either the war in Iraq or the war in Afghanistan. We've borrowed that money from the Chinese, ironically, over $1 trillion. We don't have any skin in the game. And more, war is being translated in our perception to something that has little or no cost. We kill people from high-flying unmanned drones, from Predator and Hellfire drones. We have a lot of fighting and killing done by people who aren't even in the military, who are civilian contractors, former Special Operations Forces, who are now earning 4 and 5 times what they were earning before, but who don't, you know, we don't know. They don't have to report back to Congress on what they're doing. We have no oversight. Under those kinds of circumstances, I think showing people the consequences of war, that is the dead, the wounded, the destruction, I think that's an obligation. I don't even think that's a close call.
But did we allow ourselves to get sucked into that sanitization of the war?
We not only have, we're allowing it more and more with each passing day. War is becoming something that we know next to nothing about. There was a story in the printed media, I didn't see it on television the other day, about all these drone bases, a whole ring of them that's being established around Yemen and Somalia and, you know, up in North Africa and the Gulf of Aden. We're doing more of this, not less. More and more, I mean, the CIA is becoming more and more of a covert paramilitary organization. Not healthy in a democracy. I'm not saying that they're doing any, pardon me, that they're doing anything that they shouldn't be doing. I'm just saying we need to know a little bit more about what's being done in our names.
There was a good piece on Nightline based on a book by a Washington Post reporter about this infrastructure, the national security infrastructure. Not something we see anywhere else.
No, Top Secret America by Dana Priest, who is a great Washington Post reporter. I recommend it to all your viewers out there. Just unbelievable how much money is being spent. And let me simply point out what Dana points out in her book. And that is, when civilian contractors are sent out to do what previously the military has done, they do not report up a chain of command that goes ultimately to the Secretary of Defense and the President. They report back, really, to a board of directors and the shareholders of whatever corporation owns their operation. So we now have foreign policy actions being implemented by people who are not called before Congress, who don't report to a congressional committee, don't report up the chain of command, and whose principal responsibility is to make sure that the company, that the quarterly earnings report goes up next quarter. That can't be healthy, can't be good for the country.
One of the hats you've been wearing in the last few years is a commentator and doing pieces for BBC America. One of your former reporters on Nightline, Dave Marish, a friend of ours, was an anchor at Jazeera English. Do you think this internationalization of the media will help with any of this?
Well, it would if people were watching it.
Touché.
I spoke, I spoke a couple of months ago to a former Secretary of State who said, Ted, I don't watch your old colleagues anymore. I watch Al Jazeera, because if I want to know what's going on in the Middle East, I get a far better notion of what's happening. And no, it was not Henry Kissinger. I get a far better notion of what's happening in the Middle East by watching Al Jazeera than by watching anything that the American network, the American networks barely cover it. You know, as long as there is the daily drama of what was happening in Tahrir Square, right? We covered it.
Right.
The story's not over.
Right.
The story has just begun. Who's going to take over in Egypt? That's the story. Is it going to be the Muslim Brotherhood? Is it going to be the Egyptian army? Are they going to continue having a treaty with Israel? Is it going to continue being a more or less reliable ally to the United States? I would argue these are important issues. They're going to have a tremendous impact on the amount of influence that the United States has in a part of the world from which we get a great deal of our oil and natural gas. What happens in the Persian Gulf, what happens in the Middle East, is terribly important to us.
In your last program, all of the things that you had covered over the years, from Vietnam through everything you did at Nightline, every major story in the world, instead of a compilation of all of that, you ran some of your interviews with Maury Schwartz, Tuesdays with Maury for the audience.
Yeah.
What was it about that set of interviews that made you want to end the Nightline career, as it were, on that note?
Well, there's a singular universality to death. I mean, other than birth, it is the only thing that every single one of us has in common. We're all going to die. And Maury was one of those very, very rare people who was willing to share his perceptions of dying with all of us toward the end. So I just thought it would be nice to end on a subject that we can all relate to.
Where do you go from here? You're not done, obviously.
No, I'm not, and we will see.
If you don't mind, we'll take a few questions
Sure,
from our audience. We're taping live in Seattle with an audience. Who would like to ask a question of Ted Koppel?
And actually, it's always been my observation that nobody likes to ask the first question, so why don't we skip right to the second question? See how much easier that is?
I'll break the ice. My name is Margaret Heffelfinger, class of 1974, Murrow School of Communications. Mr. Koppel, it's pretty well known that history is always being constantly rewritten. I think textbooks being written in the state of Texas now have just recently been rewritten to revise a lot of the Johnson administration. Recently, Dick Cheney came out with a book. His sense of recent history is different than the former President Bush. So we have an example of two versions of history. What question would you have asked Dick Cheney about his book or content in that book?
Well, I'm slightly embarrassed to admit to you that I haven't read Mr. Cheney's book. But I would love to do an interview with Mr. Cheney, and I will say at the outset, I was as convinced as members of the administration were in 2003 that Saddam Hussein actually did have weapons of mass destruction. I didn't think he was that far along with nuclear weapons, but the sort of nasty little joke that was going around in Washington in late 2002 and early 2003 was, we know he has weapons of mass destruction. We still have the receipts. We and the French and the British and the Germans supplied a lot of the components for the chemical weapons that Saddam Hussein had. And that was in large measure because Saddam Hussein had been our guy. We discovered our extreme distaste for Saddam Hussein very late in the game. And what I would really like to have, during the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, a war which Henry Kissinger famously described as saying, it's a shame they can't both lose. The fact, though, was we thought that an Iranian victory would be far less in the U.S. national interest than an Iraqi victory. So we provided intelligence to the Iraqis. We provided material assistance to the Iraqis. That was the same Saddam Hussein, who killed hundreds, if not thousands, of his own people using poison gas in a town called Halabja. I'd love to hear Mr. Cheney on the issue of realpolitik, on the issue of not sharing with the American public what it is we are doing. Because in point of fact, we do things like that for very pragmatic reasons. If you pick up a copy of the New York Times this morning, and I don't know when this program is running, but as of this morning, the right column lead in the New York Times has to do with the fact that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff issued a very stern warning to the Pakistani intelligence, ISI, saying that we hold them responsible for attacks on both U.S. installations in Afghanistan and on a hotel which had a lot of American guests in it. Fact of the matter is, we are getting closer and closer and closer to really revealing to the American public for the first time what we're doing in Afghanistan with 100,000 troops. We are not there so that Afghan women can go to school. We are not there because Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan represents any kind of a continuing threat. We're there because there are 100 nuclear warheads in Pakistan, next door. And we are terrified that in the event of some kind of a revolution, uprising, Islamic fundamentalist uprising, that those warheads fall into the hands of people who would give us a 9/11 on steroids. Long-winded answer, but that's what I'd like to talk to Dick Cheney about.